The English Civil War is often remembered as a fight between a king and parliament. But what if I told you it was one of the bloodiest wars in British history, filled with betrayals, mass executions, and shocking events that most people have never heard of? The English Civil War wasn't just a footnote in Britain's journey toward democracy. It was a bloody crucible that fundamentally transformed a nation, leaving scars that remain visible today, if you know where to look. These are the shocking truths about the English Civil War that history books don't tell you. The darkest chapters of a conflict that changed the course of Western civilization forever. Number 10. The English Civil War wasn't just one war, it was three. Most people think of the English Civil War as a single conflict, King Charles I versus Parliament, ending with the King's execution. But it was actually three separate wars, spanning nearly a decade of almost constant bloodshed and instability. The First Civil War, from 1642 to 1646, began when King Charles I raised his royal standard at Nottingham in August 1642, effectively declaring war on his own parliament. For 4 years, the country was divided between royalists, cavaliers, supporting the king, and parliamentarians, roundheads, fighting for increased parliamentary power. Major battles like Edgehill, Marston Moor, and Naseby claimed thousands of lives before the king was finally captured in 1646. The Second Civil War, 1648 to 1649, erupted when the imprisoned king secretly negotiated with Scottish forces to invade England on his behalf. Simultaneously, royalist uprisings flared across Wales, Kent, Essex, and Lancashire. This conflict was shorter but in many ways more brutal, as parliamentary forces under Oliver Cromwell crushed opposition with unprecedented ruthlessness. The war culminated not on a battlefield, but on a scaffold outside London's Banqueting House, where Charles I was beheaded on January 30th, 1649. The Third Civil War, from 1649 to 1651, began when Charles I's son, the future Charles II, was proclaimed king in Scotland. With Scottish backing, he led an invasion of England that ended in disaster at the Battle of Worcester in 1651. Cromwell's forces slaughtered thousands, while Charles II famously escaped by hiding in an oak tree before fleeing to France. By the time the fighting finally stopped, England had been transformed from a monarchy to a republic, the only time in its long history that it has had no king or queen on the throne. This wasn't one war, but a devastating series of conflicts that touched every corner of the British Isles. And as we're about to discover, the human cost was staggering. Before we continue with some of the darkest aspects of the English Civil War that are rarely discussed in history books, I'd like to ask for your support. If you're finding these historical revelations valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more of these hidden historical truths to light. Now let's dive into the truly shocking atrocities that many historians prefer to overlook. Number 9. One of the bloodiest wars in British history. When we think of Britain's bloodiest conflicts, our minds turn to the World Wars, with their industrialized slaughter and millions of casualties. But proportionally speaking, the English Civil War was even more devastating to the British population than World War I. The numbers are shocking. An estimated 200,000 people died from combat, disease, and famine during the English Civil War. In a country with a population of just 5 million, this represents about 4% of the entire population. For comparison, Britain lost about 2% of its population during World War I. The Battle of Naseby alone saw 1,000 royalist soldiers killed in combat, with another 4,500 captured. Many of those prisoners were later executed or died from disease in captivity. At Marston Moor, over 4,000 men died in a single day, their bodies left to rot in the summer heat. Disease also ravaged both armies and civilian populations. Typhus, known then as camp fever, swept through crowded military encampments. When soldiers carried these infections into towns and villages, local outbreaks killed thousands more. Dysentery, smallpox, and plague followed armies as they marched across the countryside. Famine claimed lives too. As armies seized food supplies, burned crops, and disrupted farming, civilians faced starvation across large parts of England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. In some regions, desperate people resorted to eating pets, vermin, and even boiled leather to survive. Entire communities vanished. The town of Basing in Hampshire saw its population reduced by more than half. Leicester lost a third of its inhabitants during and after its siege. In parts of Yorkshire and the Midlands, abandoned villages stood as silent testimony to the war's devastation. Until the 20th century, no other conflict would claim so many British lives or cause such widespread suffering. This wasn't just a political dispute. It was a national catastrophe. Number 8. Soldiers suffered on the battlefield. Forget the romanticized images of the English Civil War, with gallant cavaliers in flowing locks and gleaming breastplates charging across the battlefield. The reality for most soldiers was far grimmer. As the war dragged on, supply chains collapsed. Soldiers on both sides found themselves fighting not just the enemy, but also hunger, exposure, and disease. By 1644, many parliamentary soldiers were marching and fighting barefoot. Their shoes had worn through and replacements were nowhere to be found. One officer wrote that he could track his men's movements by the blood from their lacerated feet upon the frosted ground. During winter campaigns, frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives. Uniforms fared no better. While early in the war, some regiments had distinctive colours and equipment. By its later stages, many soldiers fought in tattered civilian clothes, held together with string and hope. One royalist commander described his men as more resembling scarecrows than His Majesty's soldiers. Food shortages were even more devastating. Armies lived by requisitioning, often a euphemism for looting, from the surrounding countryside. A letter from a parliamentary colonel in 1645 describes his men subsisting on bread more green than brown, filled with straws and chaff, which tears the guts of those who eat it. When even this rotten food ran out, soldiers resorted to eating horses, dogs, cats, and rats. Water was often as scarce as food. During summer campaigns, troops sometimes went days without clean drinking water, forced to drink from muddy puddles or stagnant ponds. Dysentery, called the bloody flux, swept through camps, killing more men than enemy bullets or blades. Medical care was primitive by modern standards. Surgery was performed without anesthesia. Amputation was the standard treatment for serious limb wounds. An infection killed countless wounded soldiers who might otherwise have survived. The psychological toll was perhaps worst of all. Soldiers went months without pay, fought former friends and neighbours, and witnessed horrors that haunted them for life. Desertion rates soared as the war progressed, with some units losing half their men, not to enemy action, but to men simply walking away. These weren't professional soldiers, but ordinary men, farmers, tradesmen, labourers, caught in extraordinary circumstances. Their suffering reveals the true face of the English Civil War, not a glorious struggle of ideals, but a desperate, brutal fight for survival. Number 7. The war created England's first and only republic. In the nearly 1,000-year span from the Norman conquest to the present day, England has been a monarchy, with one remarkable exception. For 11 years, from 1649 to 1660, England became a republic known as the Commonwealth, followed by the Protectorate. This was revolutionary, as shocking to contemporary Europeans as the fall of the Soviet Union would be in our time. The execution of Charles I sent shockwaves across the continent, where the divine right of kings was still accepted doctrine. If the English could kill their king and abolish their monarchy, what was to stop other nations from doing the same? The man at the centre of this republican experiment was Oliver Cromwell, a minor country gentleman who rose to become Lord Protector, essentially a king in all but name. Cromwell refused the crown when it was formally offered to him in 1657, yet he wielded power more absolutely than Charles I ever had. The irony was palpable. A war fought against royal tyranny had produced a military dictatorship. Parliament had executed a king who dissolved Parliament, only to be dissolved itself by Cromwell when it opposed his will. In 1653, he famously stormed into the House of Commons with armed soldiers, shouting at the elected representatives, "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing. In the name of God, go!" Under the Commonwealth and Protectorate, England underwent a profound transformation. Royal symbols were destroyed across the country, and the very concept of kingship was declared treason. Traditional celebrations like Christmas and Easter were banned as pagan or papist festivities. Theatres were closed, colourful clothes discouraged, and moral laws strictly enforced. For royalists, the hunting began in earnest. Those who had fought for the king or supported his cause found their lands confiscated, faced heavy fines, or were excluded from public life. Some were executed as traitors, while others fled abroad to join the court of the exiled Charles II. Yet this radical experiment in republican government contained the seeds of its own destruction. It depended too heavily on the personality and military prestige of Cromwell himself. When he died in 1658, his son Richard briefly succeeded him, but lacked his father's authority. By 1660, the experiment had collapsed, and Charles II returned to reclaim his father's throne. England's republic vanished, but it left an indelible mark. The restoration of the monarchy came with strings attached. Never again would an English monarch rule with absolute power. The principle that sovereign authority derives from the people, not from God, had been established in blood. Number 6. Civilian executions. Perhaps no aspect of the English Civil War is more systematically downplayed than the deliberate massacre of civilians. While military historians focus on battlefield tactics and political historians examine constitutional implications, the war's darkest chapter, the systematic killing of non-combatants, remains largely untold. Nowhere was this horror more evident than in Cromwell's campaigns in Ireland. In September 1649, his forces besieged the town of Drogheda. When the garrison refused to surrender, Cromwell's troops breached the walls and unleashed unprecedented savagery. Cromwell's own letters describe what followed. "I forbade them to spare any that were in arms in the town. That night they put to the sword about 2,000 men." But contemporary accounts reveal that the killing didn't stop with enemy soldiers. Civilians who sought sanctuary in St. Peter's Church were burned alive when parliamentarian troops set the building ablaze. Women and children were hunted through the streets and bodies were thrown into mass graves or the River Boyne. A month later at Wexford, the pattern repeated. Parliamentarian forces breached the town walls and approximately 2,000 civilians and soldiers were killed. Women who tried to escape by swimming across the harbour were shot in the water. Cromwell justified these atrocities as the righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches, claiming they were punishment for earlier Catholic uprising against Protestants. His letters show no remorse, only satisfaction. Ireland wasn't the only site of civilian massacres. In England, villages suspected of royalist sympathies faced brutal collective punishment. After the siege of Barthomley in Cheshire, parliamentary forces executed 12 captured civilians who had sought refuge in the local church. At Bolton in 1644, royalist troops under Prince Rupert killed an estimated 1,600 people, many of them non-combatants. Number 5. Soldiers sold as slaves. When we think of British slavery, we typically imagine the transatlantic slave trade that forcibly transported millions of Africans to the Americas. But during the English Civil War, thousands of British prisoners of war, predominantly royalist soldiers and Scottish prisoners, were themselves sold into slavery. After major parliamentary victories, the problem of prisoners became acute. Holding thousands of captured enemy soldiers required food, shelter, and guards, resources that were already stretched thin. Execution was one solution, but even the hardened commanders of the era balked at the wholesale slaughter of men who had surrendered. Oliver Cromwell found another option: transportation to the colonies as indentured servants, a system virtually indistinguishable from slavery in practice. Following the Battle of Worcester in 1651, approximately 10,000 Scottish soldiers who had fought for Charles II were captured, and thousands were transported to the colonies. Records show that 1,610 Scots prisoners from Worcester were sent to New England, nearly 1,000 to Virginia, and hundreds more to Barbados and other Caribbean islands. The survivors of the massacre at Drogheda suffered a similar fate, with Cromwell ordering that the remaining prisoners be shipped to Barbados. Life for these transported prisoners was brutal. In Barbados, they worked alongside enslaved Africans on sugar plantations under the tropical sun. Many died from disease, overwork, or malnourishment within their first year. Those in Virginia fared little better, clearing malarial swamps and planting tobacco in conditions that broke even the strongest men. Technically, these prisoners were indentured servants who would be freed after a set period, usually 7 to 10 years. But many plantation owners simply ignored these terms, keeping their workers in bondage until death. The fate of these men was deliberately obscured in subsequent histories. It complicated the narrative of British liberty and parliamentary democracy emerging from the Civil War. It's easier to celebrate the birth of modern democratic principles than to acknowledge that one of their first acts was to enslave fellow Britons. Some historians estimate that as many as 50,000 British prisoners were transported into servitude during and immediately after the Civil War. Their descendants still live in parts of the Caribbean and the southern United States, many unaware of their ancestors' origins as prisoners of a forgotten war. Number 4. The King's trial was a political stunt. The trial of Charles I is often portrayed as a watershed moment in legal history. The first time a European monarch was tried in a court of law by his own people. Textbooks describe it as the birth of the principle that no one, not even a king, is above the law. The reality was far less noble. Charles I's trial wasn't a genuine legal proceeding, but a carefully orchestrated political theatre, designed to give a veneer of legitimacy to a decision that had already been made. The king was going to die. The trial merely provided legal window dressing for what was essentially a political execution. The court itself was illegitimate by any legal standard of the time. It was created by a rump parliament. What remained of the House of Commons after Colonel Thomas Pride forcibly excluded about 140 members who might have opposed the trial. No House of Lords approved the tribunal, and no existing law authorized putting a king on trial. Of the 135 commissioners appointed to judge the king, only about half attended the trial. Many refused to participate, recognizing the dangerous precedent it would set. Several who did attend later claimed they had been coerced through threats of violence. Before the trial even began, the court had drafted a death warrant. They just needed to add the details and signatures. As legal historian Geoffrey Robertson noted, in modern terms, this was a show trial whose outcome was determined before it started. Charles himself recognized this, which is why he refused to enter a plea. He repeatedly challenged the court's jurisdiction, asking, "I would know by what power I am called hither. By what authority? I mean lawful authority." It was a legally sound argument. There was no law under which a king could be tried, but it was dismissed out of hand. Even the execution was surrounded by unusual secrecy. The executioner was masked not just to conceal his identity from the crowd, but because his identity was hidden even from most officials. Historical evidence suggests that the regular executioner, Richard Brandon, may have refused to perform the deed, forcing authorities to find a replacement. Whoever wielded the axe was paid an extraordinary sum, £100, equivalent to several years' wages for an ordinary worker, and immediately disappeared from historical record. Number 3. The war turned neighbour against neighbour. Civil wars are, by definition, domestic conflicts, but few have torn the social fabric as completely as the English Civil War. This wasn't simply a war between professional armies. It was a conflict that divided communities, friends, and even families. In villages across England, people who had lived as neighbours for decades suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. Church congregations split, town councils fractured. Market days became tense affairs where former friends passed without acknowledgement. The Earl of Barrymore in Ireland saw 3 of his sons join the Royalists, while the 4th fought for Parliament. Sir Edmund Verney, the King's standard-bearer, went to war for Charles even while his son Ralph supported Parliament. Lord Falkland, a moderate who reluctantly sided with the king, faced his cousin Hampden across the battlefield. This division of families had practical consequences. Estates were confiscated if one member fought for the wrong side. The social bonds that had held communities together for generations were severed, sometimes permanently. Local government collapsed in many areas as traditional authority figures chose sides or fled. Into this vacuum stepped military commanders who imposed martial law, further eroding the normal patterns of community life. Village records from the period tell of summary executions, forced requisitioning of food and supplies, and arbitrary punishment of civilians suspected of aiding the enemy. The psychological impact was perhaps most devastating of all. Individuals were forced to make impossible choices between loyalty to the king, to Parliament, to their local community, to their religion, or to their family. Whatever choice they made, they would be betraying someone or something they valued. Diaries from the period reveal the anguish this caused. One Hampshire farmer wrote, "Brother does not speak to brother, nor father to son. We who shared bread at Christmas now eye each other as murderers might." The English Civil War didn't just change England's government, it fundamentally altered the relationships between its people. creating divides that would take generations to heal. Number 2. The royal use of witchcraft. In our scientific age, it's easy to forget that the 17th century was a time when belief in supernatural forces was not just common, but taken for granted. During the English Civil War, this meant that alongside muskets and pikes, both sides deployed what they believed to be magical weapons. The Royalists in particular turned to occult practices when conventional warfare failed them. King Charles I himself consulted astrologers regularly, timing military operations according to favorable planetary alignments. His armies traveled with court astrologers who cast horoscopes before battles and advised commanders on propitious days for attack. William Lilly, the most famous astrologer of the age, initially worked for royalist commanders, but later switched sides, publishing predictions of parliamentary victory that devastated royalist morale. His almanacs were bestsellers, read by soldiers and civilians alike for guidance during the chaotic war years. Beyond astrology, more direct forms of magical practice were employed. Court records reveal cases of royalist sympathizers arrested for performing rituals intended to protect the king or cause harm to parliamentary leaders. In 1645, Parliament passed the Witchcraft Act, making it easier to prosecute those using supernatural means to influence the war's outcome. Some royalist soldiers carried witch bottles, small containers filled with urine, hair, nail clippings, and bent pins, believed to protect against enemy bullets. Others wore amulets inscribed with magical symbols or biblical verses, thought to make them invulnerable to harm. More sinister were the documented cases of suspected witchcraft used offensively. In 1645, at the height of the conflict, a woman in Essex was tried for allegedly using witchcraft to locate parliamentary supply convoys for royalist raiders. In Suffolk, another woman was executed for supposedly causing a parliamentary cavalry unit's horses to fall mysteriously ill before a crucial engagement. The infamous witch hunter Matthew Hopkins found his career flourishing during the Civil War years, accusing dozens of women of using witchcraft to aid the royalist cause. His victims were overwhelmingly from parliamentary-held areas, suggesting his witch-finding activities may have had a political dimension. For the deeply religious soldiers of both armies, the conflict was as much a spiritual battle as a physical one. Puritan parliamentary troops believed they were God's chosen instruments fighting against the forces of Antichrist, while royalist forces saw themselves as defenders of God's anointed king against heretical rebels. Number 1. The English Civil War never truly ended. When Charles II returned to England in 1660 to reclaim his father's throne, many hoped it would draw a line under the tumultuous Civil War period. The new king himself declared his desire to heal and settle, proclaiming a general amnesty for former enemies, with the notable exception of those directly involved in his father's execution. But the fundamental tensions that had triggered the Civil War remained unresolved. It took only 25 years for these tensions to erupt again. In 1685, Charles II's brother James II ascended to the throne. A converted Catholic with absolutist tendencies, James soon alienated both the political establishment and the general population. By 1688, the country stood once again on the brink of civil war. This time, however, the political elite acted preemptively. They invited William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law, to invade England with a small army. When James's support collapsed, he fled to France, and William and his wife Mary were crowned as joint monarchs. This glorious revolution of 1688 is often portrayed as bloodless, but this is a simplification. While England avoided full-scale civil war, fighting erupted in Scotland and Ireland, where thousands died in battles and sieges that were direct continuations of the Civil War conflicts. The events of 1688 to 89 finally resolved the central question of the original Civil War. Parliament was now unquestionably supreme. The Bill of Rights of 1689 explicitly limited royal power and established Parliament's authority over taxation, the military, and the succession itself. But even this wasn't a clean ending. The exiled James II and his descendants, the Jacobites, continued to claim the throne, leading to further rebellions in 1715 and 1745. These weren't separate conflicts, but the final chapters of the struggle that began in 1642. Even after the Jacobite threat was extinguished, the political divisions of the Civil War persisted in transmuted form. The Tory and Whig parties that dominated British politics into the 19th century had their roots in the royalist and parliamentary factions of the Civil War era. More fundamentally, The constitutional issues raised by the Civil War continue to resonate today. Questions about the limits of executive power, the role of religion in public life, the relationship between central government and local authorities, and the tension between security and liberty were all central to the Civil War and remain contested in modern politics. How many more secrets from this war remain lost to history? Countless, no doubt. But by examining even the fragments that survive, we gain insight not just into a particular 17th century conflict, but into the fragility of civilization itself and the terrible price paid when it collapses. Thank you for watching Nefarious History. If you found this journey into one of history's most misunderstood conflicts fascinating, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'll see you next time.